Thank you very much. As I said before, it is a pleasure and an honor to be with you. And especially at this moment, it is very moving to me that science and scholarship go on in Portugal under the most difficult conditions. You all have my greatest admiration. Okay. This is a famous image. It's an image that many of you have probably seen of a black hole at the center of the M87 galaxy, about 53 million light years from Earth. And it's the achievement of over 200 scientists working all over the world, from Nijmegen in the Netherlands to the South Pole Telescope in Antarctica, from Atacama in Chile to Cambridge, Massachusetts in the United States. And you get some sense of just how global that network is here. I begin with this image because it's not only an epoch-making scientific achievement, it's also a sterling example of a scientific and scholarly ethos that first emerged in the 19th century and which is still very much with us, although I'm going to argue that it is endangered at the moment under current conditions. And I'm going to argue that this is an ethos which is both ethical and epistemic. That is, it's epistemic in that it aims to achieve truth, and it's ethical in that it binds its members to certain self-denying standards of conduct. This ethos was both collaborative and collective. It was collaborative in that for the first time in the last part of the 19th century, scholars and scientists, and I should say that this ethos is as much about the humanities as it is about the sciences. For the first time in the last half of the 19th century, scholars and scientists banded together in international projects that required vast investments of time, money, and manpower, not just for the present moment, but for decades and sometimes even for generations. And I'll just name two of these ambitious undertakings. One, as I said, was in the humanities, and indeed it was the first of these such undertakings. It's the Corpus Inscriptionum Latinarum, the collection of all Latin inscriptions from Roman antiquity like this one in Spain, begun in 1854 by the Prussian Academy of Sciences. And the other example is, once again, from astronomy. It is the Carte du Ciel, or the Great Star Map, launched at the Paris Observatory in 1887. These two projects, one of them in classical philology and the other in astronomy, were unprecedented in their grand scope, their huge budgets, and labor organization on an international scale. In both of these cases, only the combined and sustained efforts of many researchers from many countries over many decades could achieve the goals of these ambitious projects. But I said that these projects were not just collaborative, they were also collective, and it's the collective part which interests me more. Individual researchers who signed up to these projects had to sacrifice their own research projects, in many cases their own careers, and sometimes their safety for the good of the whole. The philologists who collected the inscriptions from those parts, especially of Southern Europe and Northern Africa, risked malaria, cholera, kidnapping, or worse during their fieldwork. Here you see one of the initiators of the project, the German philologist Theodor Mommsen, trying to get a Latin inscription in the Castel di Sango in Italy, much to the amusement of the locals. Mommsen's predecessor in collecting inscriptions in Italy, the Dane Olaf Kellerman, died of cholera in the process. The same was true, although perhaps to a less death-defying extent, for the astronomers. I use this image of the telescope that was used for the Australian contribution to the Carte du Ciel, because the Australians ended up having to photograph almost a fifth of the night sky. They were the only operating observatory in the Southern Hemisphere, which meant that, since this lasted for most of the 20th century, Australia missed out on the most exciting research developments in astrophysics for almost a century because of their commitment to this project. No wonder the proponents of both of these collaborations described their projects as monuments, as the modern age's answer to medieval cathedrals, a metaphor they often invoked, built with the blood, sweat, and tears by hundreds of anonymous laborers. To return to the Event Horizon telescope collaboration with which I began, although the displaced language of religious sacrifice and cathedral-like monuments is rarely used these days, this collaboration also demanded that participants embrace the ethos of the collective. So the data on which this image is based had already been collected by September of 2017, but the image was not released until the 10th of April, 2019. Most of the intervening 2 years was spent correlating and checking the data by 4 independent teams. They were independent because the researchers feared that they might be influenced by each other and by their own wishful thinking to detect an object that wasn't really there. You have to remember, this is an extraordinarily faint signal coming from 53 million light years away with a great deal of noise in it. In other words, these researchers feared their own subjectivity. These measures of extreme caution and self-restraint were, I think, a modern form of the spiritual exercises that Jorge mentioned in his introduction, but they are in the service not of moral and religious virtues, but of epistemic virtues. As one of the lead scientists on the project, Heiko Falke, said in an interview, "I would love to see that thing," he means the image of the black hole, and that alone makes me very suspicious of myself. So during that 2-year interval of checks and counterchecks, all of the researchers, 200 of them, more than 200 of them, were sworn to complete secrecy about what would be, if it were confirmed, the most spectacular scientific discovery of the century. Not one of those over 200 people broke their vow of silence until the official announcement on the 10th of April, 2019. The ethos of self-restraint and sacrifice, of individual interests to the goals of the collective, is still powerful, at least in astronomy. But it's definitely under attack in both the humanities and the sciences. It is not because science and scholarship have become more competitive these days. They have always been fiercely competitive. The collaborations I just described, both past and present, were and are tense with conflicts over professional reputations, commercial interests in the manufacture of instruments, institutional rivalries, research agendas for years to come, and national cultural prestige on the world stage. Nonetheless, an ethos instilled by graduate training and especially constantly reinforced by the daily exercise, for example, the daily exercise of checking calculations and images, as well as the rewards of peer recognition, has usually kept conflict and destructive competition in check. However, like every ethos, the collective ethos of sacrifice for the good of the whole in both science and scholarship thrives only insofar as the community involved can define its own standards of merit, both in terms of ethics and epistemology. And it's that autonomy which is now threatened. Let me talk about now what is new about the current situation. First, the sheer numbers of people and institutions involved in the competition. As I said, competition is not new. If anything, competition in earlier ages was even more savage among scholars and scientists. But the inflation of numbers has made a big difference. I'll say more about that in a moment. Second, the enormous increases in public financial support for research. This is especially the case, but not exclusively the case, in democratic polities that also require accountability for public funds spent. And third, and to my mind, the most important, the growing distrust of expert judgment. I'm going to talk about all three of these very quickly, being quite brief about the first two, more obvious points, and then I'll turn to the third, which is, in my opinion, the most important factor. It's very difficult to get reliable figures about just how many researchers are currently at work worldwide. The OECD estimates somewhere between 8.5 and 10 million, with an annual growth rate of about 4.2%. Here you see the, I think, very graphic presentation of the increase in active peer-reviewed learned journals since 1665 with the philosophical transactions of the Royal Society and the Histoire des Mémoires de Paris Académie Royale des Sciences. The UNESCO estimates that there are about 2.5 million articles per year published just in peer-reviewed English language journals, and that's probably an underestimate. So under such circumstances, it's not surprising that the peer review system, which began really only on a large scale in the mid-20th century, is collapsing under the sheer weight of demand. And I think all of you know all too well about the demands, the increasing demands that are made on your time to review and evaluate articles, books, and grant proposals, for me to belabor this point. So this is pressure that comes from within the scientific system. But even more pressure comes from the outside, because more and more governments are investing more and more money, as measured by a percentage of their gross domestic product, in research and development. They are also demanding that those who receive that money hold to standards of transparency and accountability. This means, in turn, that they ask for independent evaluations. Because in the language of politicians, independence means that the researchers themselves cannot be trusted to evaluate the fruits of the projects which have been supported. These governments have turned more and more to proxy indicators that can be mechanically computed, for example, Hirsch factors or other bibliometric indices. Now, independent does not mean accurate. As everyone who participates in the rankings game knows, these, especially, for example, the Shanghai University rankings, these are based on a great deal of plain insider gossip. But from the standpoint of the governments that offer funding for research, independence is more important than accuracy. The fact that these proxy indicators and mechanical indicators can be gamed and are being gamed all the time is less relevant than the fact that they are assumed, at least by the governments, to exclude subjectivity. And of course, governments, especially democratic governments, are even more afraid of the appearance of corruption than whether, in fact, their investments bear fruit. Although, of course, the Nobel Prizes have become to international science what the Olympics are to international sport. That is, a court of national pride and prestige. This brings me to my final point, which is the distrust of judgment. Whether in the name of efficiency, there's just too much for overburdened referees to read, or accountability, recipients of public money should not be the judges of whether it's been well spent. More and more evaluations of research excellence, especially but not exclusively in the natural sciences, are being made on the basis of proxy indicators that can be mechanically computed or outsourced, for example, the international rankings of universities. But I repeat what everybody already knows. These proxy indicators are just that, proxies for the real thing, and they can be gamed, they are being gamed all the time. The real thing for which they are proxies is expert, impartial judgment. Judgment, however, is not only in short supply, it has increasingly fallen into disrepute. The reasons are many and complex, but chief among them is the conflation of judgment with the purest subjectivity. Three factors contribute to this conflation. First, a prevalent view that human motivation is not only self-interested, but self-interested in the most naked sense, that is, the egotistical pursuit of money and glory. Under these circumstances, everyone must be suspected of partiality, and unfortunately, there have been some recent examples of high-profile self-promotion, especially on the part of certain geneticists. Here I show simply as an allegory for all of them, the geneticist and biotech businessman Craig Venter vaunting his wealth on his yacht. Second, there is the reduction of all objectivity to mechanical objectivity, which defines any assessment of merit that cannot be performed algorithmically as ipso facto subjective. Yet there is no escape from judgment, and not only in the humanities. To return to the example with which I began, the Event Horizons Telescope collaboration that produced ultimately the first image of a black hole, those 2 years of calculations concluded in secrecy by 4 independent teams, all in the name of blocking their own subjectivity, in the end had to have recourse to their own trained judgment as to which algorithms they would use and which image to publish. The third problem, impartiality, is an ethical problem. It's not one of either expertise or efficiency. The ethos of disinterested science and scholarship was a very long time in the making, centuries, if not millennia. And it is always fragile precisely because it is always in tension with the values of society at large. This image from the 19th century, which many of you will recognize as Thales, the ancient Greek philosopher Thales, is typical. He is about to step into a well because his eyes are trained on the stars. It's why the popular persona of the scholar and scientist emphasizes absent-mindedness, eccentricity, or even madness, because the definition of merit in scholarship and science is distinctly at odds with the definition of value and merit in society at large. The so-called disinterestedness of scholars and scientists is, in fact, an intense interest in things considered unimportant by almost everyone else, except a small group of initiates. It is this small community that defines, cultivates, and enforces an ethos of honor and shame. This is an archaic ethos, and it may seem out of place in the modern world, but that's precisely the point. Without that ethos of honor and shame, constantly exercised by the daily practices of scholars and scientists, no merit can endure. Thank you very much for your attention.